What a healing Jesus I have found in you, and what a healing Jesus to restore, refresh, and renew. What a healing Jesus, oh, for such a time as this, arise on healing wings, Son of righteousness. Arise on healing wings, Son of righteousness. I'm Eddie Hyatt. Welcome to another telecast of Revive America. I was just singing a little chorus there about what a healing Jesus I have found in you. Because later in the broadcast, we're going to talk more about Jesus the healer. But before we go there, I have a few things that I want to share with you. You know, this broadcast is called Revive America because we know that our country is in dire need of another great revival, spiritual awakening. And here is a prayer from the Psalms that we have used. Will you not revive us again? The prayer of the psalmist praying for revival for the nation of Israel there in the Old Testament. Revive means to bring back to life. We should be praying that for our churches, praying that for our nation. Oh God, will you not revive us again, that your people may rejoice in you. Show us your mercy, Lord, and grant us your salvation. Yes, may it be in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. You know, I want to mention a book that I have written. It's been translated into several languages. It's still being used as a textbook in Bible colleges and seminaries all over the world. It's called 2,000 Years of Charismatic Christianity, and it is a history of spiritual awakenings, a history of revival movements from the day of Pentecost down to the present time. If you don't have a copy of this book, consider yourself uneducated about church history. This book will greatly bless you. I've received, reports from all over the world. When this book first came out, I'll never forget this, in 1996, and it wasn't too long before it was out. It got spread all over the world. And there was a professor from a college in Pasadena, California, happened to see him at a meeting in Florida, and he said, I was just in the Czech Republic, and there was a Czech preacher holding up your book and telling the people about it. Wow. And so if you don't have this book, I encourage you to get a copy of it. You can get a copy right there from my website. Go to my website, eddiehyatt.com, click on bookstore. And also it's available in Kindle and hard copy from Amazon. And don't forget about this book. This book is really the basis of this broadcast, Revive America, which documents how our nation was birthed out of a great spiritual awakening and how our country was founded on Judeo-Christian principles and values and why we must have another spiritual awakening. And that's also the reason on this broadcast every week we have a Founders Corner where we look at one of the founders of this nation in order to highlight the Christian values upon which this country was founded and to show how far we have drifted as a nation. And the only thing that will save us is another spiritual awakening sent from heaven in response to the cries and the prayers of God's people. In the Founders Corner this week, we're going to look again at Benjamin Franklin for a couple of reasons. We looked at him last week, but we're going to look at him more. One reason is because I have just written a book on Benjamin Franklin called The Faith and Vision of Benjamin Franklin. The subtitle is How the Skeptical Printer of Philadelphia Returned to His Puritan Roots and the Puritan Vision for a Christian America. This book challenges some very established erroneous beliefs that would be found in school books and textbooks throughout America, that Benjamin Franklin was a deist who didn't want Christian principles in the public venue or public schools, which is a false narrative. It is erroneous. It is not true. The very opposite is true. Benjamin Franklin wanted Christian principles taught in public schools in every venue of America because he believed that it was the only thing that would restrain evil and bring about a stable and prosperous society. And so this book is available. It's not on my website yet, but it will be next month. But it is available right now from Amazon in the Kindle format. And if you want to order the hard copy from Amazon, it's scheduled to be released in around the middle of July. But you can order both the hard copy and you can immediately download the Kindle. If you have a Kindle, you can download it into your Kindle, and it's available now. So I encourage you. This book will greatly encourage you. And it shows not only the faith and vision of Benjamin Franklin, but it broadens and shows the faith and vision of the early founders of this nation and how they wanted a nation that was built on Christian principles and values. What they didn't want was what they had left in Europe, was a national church. A church that was supported and upheld by the government and imposed on the populace. That's why they gave us the First Amendment, that Congress shall make no law concerning the establishment of religion. What were they talking about? Congress is not going to establish a national church like they had left in Europe that was oppressive, nor hinder the free exercise thereof. What they wanted and what they gave us was a separation of church and state, but not a separation of God and state. Everything that they said and did tells us that they wanted God in all aspects of this nation they were founding. And you will see that in this new book. Now, let's go ahead and look a little bit more about Benjamin Franklin and some of the things that are revealed in this book. As we said last week, he was born in Boston and reared in a Christian Puritan home. But he was a voracious reader, a very bright young man. He said he could not remember a time when he couldn't read. And he read everything that he could get his hands on. And he was put in when he was 12 years old as an apprentice for his older brother, who had established a printing business in Boston. And as an apprentice in those days, it was like an indentured servant. And he signed an agreement that he would work for his brother until he was 21 years of age. But his brother was quite abusive. They had a lot of quarrels, and there were times even his brother physically beat him. And so at the age of 17, he ran away from home. He didn't tell his parents because he knew his parents would try to stop him from leaving. But he went down to the Boston Harbor and he caught a sloop to New York City. Got to New York City, didn't know anybody, had very little money, 17 years of age. And so he had learned the printing business because he had been working in a print shop now for 5 years. So he found a printer and asked for employment. Well, this printer didn't have any employment, but he said, you know, I have a son that's opened a print shop in Philadelphia, which is just not too far further south of New York City. And so he headed out for Philadelphia, arrived in Philadelphia, tired, hungry, with $1 in his pocket. But he did find employment and went on from there. And in his early years, he did, as a young man, declare that he was a deist because he had read all of these books about it and so on. But as he matured, he moved back to his Puritan roots. He moved back to the faith of his mother and his father and his ancestors. And as he got older, it's obvious in his writings that he gained a greater appreciation for his heritage and for his Puritan heritage and for his Puritan parents and grandparents and so on. Also, a powerful influence in drawing him back to the faith of his childhood was his friendship, and this makes me laugh, with the most famous preacher of the Great Awakening, George Whitefield. George Whitefield was a Methodist preacher. Now, this is before Methodism was a church. It was a revival movement. Whitefield was actually ordained with the Anglican Church. He had grown up in a very poor family. His father had died when he was very small. His mother raised him, and she had what was called an inn. And it was a small place where people could stay, but she also served food and drinks, alcoholic drinks and so on. And growing up, he worked in the inn. They were very poor. But through somebody, his mother got to know there was an opening made for George Whitefield to go to Oxford University. Man, this was a big deal. It's a big deal today, and it was a big deal then. But he went there as a servitor, which means he had to work his way through college. And he was actually, he was like a servant there. He had to do things like carrying out the garbage. He had to wake up the higher class, the upper echelon students. He had to wake them up in the morning. He had to carry their books. He even had to help them with their assignments. And so he was a servant. Hey, that was good preparation for the ministry, because Jesus said that we are supposed to have an attitude of a servant. We're supposed to have a servant's heart. Well, at Oxford, he met John and Charles Wesley. That's why God sent him to Oxford. He met John and Charles Wesley. He became a part of the Holy Club, which developed into the Methodist revival, which was a powerful move of God. And because he graduated from Oxford, he learned Greek and Latin, and he graduated from Oxford. Then he applied for ordination in the Anglican Church, the official church of England. And at the age of 21, he was ordained by the Bishop of Gloucester. And he recalled in his journal, George Whitefield did, because he was a very devout young man. He had given himself, consecrated himself completely to God. He said that when the bishop laid his hands on him, ordaining him, and I'm sure this had nothing to do with the bishop's hands laid on him, it had to do with what was in his heart. He said, I offered my spirit, soul, and body up to God. He said, my heart was melted down, and I offered myself up completely to God for the work of His sanctuary. Even as a young man, he was a gifted talker, speaker, orator, and of course very passionate. And he began to preach in the churches, and he gained a reputation. They called him the boy preacher because he was very thin, very young looking, looked like a kid. They called him the boy preacher, but wow, could he preach. And the churches around London, everywhere he'd preach, they would fill up and overflowing with people, and people hanging in the windows. And then because he was preaching about a new birth which he had experienced, which he had learned from the Wesleys, and which he too had experienced, the Church of England wasn't all into this new birth stuff and the Bible being what is your guide. They were more into the church and the liturgy and the sacraments and the priesthood and the bishop. And so the churches began to close the doors to young George. Well, he started preaching outdoors. Huge crowds, 10,000, 20,000. 40,000 in these outdoors coming out to hear him preach, and people weeping and being moved by God. And England is starting to be awakened by the Spirit of God. He feels in his heart God calls him to America, which is 13 colonies. They're not a nation, they're British colonies. And so he makes plans to come to America. And he has this prayer in his heart that God will forge the 13 American colonies into one nation under God. And at the age of 24, he came to colonial America with that prayer. Now that painting you see of him would be from much later in life. One of the first places he stopped, not the first place, but one of them was in Philadelphia. And he got acquainted with people there. He began to preach outdoors. He preached from the steps of the Philadelphia courthouse. At that time, Philadelphia only had about 12,000 people. But the first night he preached, it was estimated there were 6,000 people there. And then the next night it grew to estimates to 10,000 people. So just about the entire city is turning out to hear George Whitefield. Now Benjamin Franklin is there. He's the deist printer with Puritan roots, raised in a Christian home, but he's moved away from it. And now he has a printing business. And Benjamin Franklin attends these meetings. And he described in his autobiography what happened to his city, now his hometown of Philadelphia. Now I want you to notice that he wasn't turned off by what was happening. This is in line with his history. This is in line with his heritage. And so he describes it as wonderful, what is happening. Benjamin Franklin says it was wonderful to see the change soon made in the manners of our inhabitants. He says from being thoughtless or indifferent about religion, it seemed as if all the world were growing religious. And I don't have this part there on the screen, but he went on to say, he said, you can't walk through Philadelphia without hearing people singing and praising God coming from houses on every street. What did Benjamin Franklin think about it? Did he think this was terrible? No, he said it was wonderful to see the change that was being made. Now, in this first visit, Benjamin Franklin and George Whitefield were introduced. In many ways, they were very different, but it was the beginning of a very close friendship that would continue for 31 years until the time of Whitefield's death. Whitefield died a long time before Franklin did, but this close friendship would continue for 31 years. Even at this first meeting, they made an arrangement that was mutually beneficial, that Franklin would print and distribute Whitefield's sermons and his journal, because he had been keeping a journal of his travels and how God was moving, how God was working. So it was mutually beneficial. It helped make Benjamin Franklin wealthy, because probably at this time there was nothing more popular in print than George Whitefield's sermons and journals, and they were selling like hotcakes. And even in Benjamin Franklin's newspaper, and I quote this in my book, the Pennsylvania Gazette, in one of the newspapers, and this was after Whitefield had already left, he said, those who want a copy of his sermons, he said, we have had more orders than we have printed up sermons. So we will give priority to those who bring the money. And so George Whitefield helped make Benjamin Franklin wealthy, and Benjamin Franklin helped Whitefield get his sermons and his message out to the colonies. George Whitefield also went out of his way to establish a friendship, and he asked Benjamin Franklin for his advice about business matters. And he asked Benjamin Franklin advice about an orphanage that he was establishing in Georgia. And there was a mutual attraction to one another. And Benjamin Franklin, he later established good relationships with his brother James back in Boston, and his family and everything. But he said to his brother James, Whitefield is a good man, and I love him. Now, they kept up a correspondence, wrote back and forth, that was carried on. And this correspondence reveals how Franklin moved back to his Puritan roots and the Puritan vision for a Christian nation. And this is all revealed in my new book that is available now from Amazon, The Faith and Vision of Benjamin Franklin. And we'll be talking more about Benjamin Franklin in another program, but I want now to go to God's Word for today. But let me say, I'm wanting to go there, but my heart is still here with this spiritual awakening. So I think that I need to just stay for a little bit with George Whitefield and Benjamin Franklin and this friendship that was forged between them and how they were close right up until the time of George Whitefield's death in 1770, and how George Whitefield's influence on Benjamin Franklin moved him back to his Puritan roots and moved him back to his Puritan heritage. For example, just a few years after this first visit of George Whitefield, by the way, George Whitefield made 7 visits to North America. He crossed the ocean 13 times. I want you to know that's a lot of times to cross the ocean in a ship for that day. But he crossed the ocean 13 times. He made 7 visits. He loved America. He loved the colonists. And he even stated that he felt that America was to be his primary venue of ministry and service to the Lord. And everywhere he went, incredible crowds came out. He was an incessant worker. He traveled continually up and down the East Coast. He went to Franklin's hometown of Boston, which had a population at that time of about 17,000. But it was estimated that 25,000 people turned out on the Boston Common as George Whitefield preached his message of the new birth to them. One thing that Whitefield emphasized, he emphasized that so many people, religious people, had built their faith on a faulty foundation. And the faulty foundations for Whitefield were church membership, the family you were born into, your Christian heritage, your good works, and all of these things. He said these are faulty foundations that people have built upon, thinking that it gives them acceptance with God. But Whitefield said what is needed is a new birth through faith in Jesus Christ. And it was the message for that hour. And thousands and multitudes in colonial America responded to that message. That is why Thomas Kidd, who is the professor of history at Baylor University, calls George Whitefield America's spiritual founding father. But just a few years after that first visit of Whitefield to America and to Philadelphia, there is already indication of how Franklin has moved back to his Puritan roots. For in the early 1740s, there was war between Great Britain and Spain. And since America was a British colony and possession, and Philadelphia was one of the largest cities and a seaport, there was great concern that some Spanish marauding ships may come by Philadelphia and maraud the area. And there were no British troops there to defend them. So Franklin led the way. He was a leader. He led the way in organizing militias and placing cannons in strategic locations overlooking the harbor. And then, when they had finished this, he exhorted the assembly, which was the governing body of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. He exhorted the assembly and the governor to issue a proclamation calling the people of Pennsylvania to a day of prayer and fasting. Now, he tells about this in his own words in his autobiography. Yeah, they had done what they could do in the natural. He said, now we need to call a day of prayer and fasting. But he said that the people of Pennsylvania didn't know anything about a day of prayer and fasting. He said, so I called upon, because of my Puritan New England heritage, he said, I knew about it. And he did, because from the time that the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620, there had been these regular proclamations calling the people and the inhabitants to set aside days for prayer, for fasting, and sometimes for Thanksgiving. Well, Franklin said they didn't know anything about such a day of prayer and fasting. He said, but because of my New England heritage, I knew about it. He said, so I wrote up the proclamation. And he said they approved it, and they put it in print. And because there were many Germans at that time who had immigrated from Germany, he said it was printed in both German and in English and distributed throughout Pennsylvania. And so Benjamin Franklin and the leaders of Pennsylvania there in the early 1740s, they all participated together in a day of prayer and fasting. And in the proclamation, Benjamin Franklin exhorted them to implore, to ask for the assistance and the protection of heaven upon their colony. Oh, my friends, Benjamin Franklin did not see any separation of church and state. For sure, he did not want a national church supported and undergirded by the government that would try to force its views upon the people. He did not want that any more than any other of the founders. Oh, but he wanted God in their lives. He wanted the people to pray and to implore heaven for His assistance and for His protection in their lives. That's the real Benjamin Franklin. That's the Benjamin Franklin we haven't been told about. That's the Benjamin Franklin that the left, the secularist, does not want you to know about. But my friends, I want to tell you again, you see, Benjamin Franklin was impacted by this great awakening, by his friend with George Whitefield and this great awakening. And do you see how this moved him back to his Puritan roots, to his Puritan heritage, had such an impact upon his life? And this continued throughout the rest of his life as he and Whitefield exchanged letters. And a few years after that, he founded an academy, a school. And he sent the proposal that he had put out to the inhabitants of Philadelphia about this academy. He sent it to his friend Whitefield to have a look at. And he said in his proposal that they wanted to teach the students Christianity. And that school today is the University of Pennsylvania. My friends, we're approaching a birthday, July the 4th, of this nation. Our country was built on Judeo-Christian principles and values by Christian people. Will you join me and others in praying that God will send another great awakening, that He will revive America again? I'm Eddie Hyatt. I'm so glad you've joined me for this telecast, and I look forward to seeing you for the next telecast of Revive America. God bless you.